And we're happy to have you here.
Thanks. We're enjoying our visit. Okay, well, last time we were here, or together, we talked about your family history, and now I'd like to talk a little bit about your childhood. From the time you were born until you were 11 or 12 years old, what's the earliest thing that you remember? Do you remember it, your youngest?
I remember quite a bit about my childhood in those years. We lived on 73rd Street, and our friends and neighbors in the area were the Hexters, the Dowbys, the Jerome Dowbys who moved to Akron, and several other names that I don't recall, except for the Scovilles, who lived directly across the street from us. That was Malcolm Scoville. He was a great football player, and his son turned out to be a great athlete at Yale, and got his training at University School. And our neighbors were all very friendly.
What kind of neighborhood was it?
It was a good neighborhood. We were less than 3 houses down from Euclid Avenue. And in those days, Euclid Avenue was a prime street with beautiful residences on it. It wasn't commercial at all. And the Bradleys lived on the corner. They owned the baseball team, and they kept horses in their stable on the second floor. One of the horses made a mistake and went out the door, which was the hayloft door, and naturally he had to be shot. He landed on concrete. But the Bradleys were on one corner, and the Nortons on the other corner. And
what year was this? Like, what time frame was this?
Well, my father and mother moved to 73rd Street when Mildred was born, but I don't think she was born in the house. She may have been born in the apartment they were living in. And from that time on, I was born in 1907, and Helene was born in 1910.
Where were you born?
On 73rd Street.
In the house, though, or in a hospital?
In the house. All our doctors in those days came to the house, and Mom didn't go to the hospital for me or for Helene.
Do you know how much you weighed?
I can't remember that.
Don't remember? I don't know how much I weighed either. I think somewhere over 8 pounds, but I'm not sure. I remember that I was a big baby.
Right.
Do you know if you were nursed or bottle fed or anything like that?
Well, we had a nurse. Nursey came with us, but not till after I was born. We had a nurse when I was born, but I don't recall much about her. But I do remember quite a bit about the nurse that came to us when Pet was born.
Do you remember when Pet was born? Do you remember that day at all?
No, I was 3 years old.
Of course not.
I don't remember it fully. The only things I can tell you that I remember about Fairmount Boulevard, about 73rd Street, was that we had a very comfortable house. It had one bathroom on the second floor and a lavatory in the basement. And all of us used the same tub and facilities on the first floor. And we remained there until 1918, when we moved on Fairmount Boulevard. And of course, on Fairmount Boulevard, each bedroom had a bath with it. It was quite a different setup for all of us, but we were old enough to appreciate it.
How old were you when you moved there?
I was 11 years old.
About Fairmount, do you remember of any
Wait a
of your...
minute, am I right? I was born in 1907. I was, yeah, 11 years old.
Well, describe that neighborhood at the time, Fairmont Boulevard.
Well, for, Fairmont, 73rd Street was a nice neighborhood, but we had a lot of good people on the street. The Ladd family, which were doctors. Harry Peters, the president of University School, lived on that street because University School was located at the end of the street on Huff Avenue. And there were many other very nice families. We had one murder on 73rd Street and Huff Avenue. One murder, yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, nothing much I can tell about. It was in those days very seldom anything like that happened. And I don't know the details. I can't remember the details, but it was a very sad occasion.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about the Fairmont Boulevard neighborhood?
Well, it was a good neighborhood in those days. We had our friends, Paul and Richard Hexter, who were older than we were, and both of the boys turned out to be very fine people. Paul Hexter was one of the finest jazz pianists in the country. That was his reputation. And he was a great photographer. He had all kinds of talents. He helped me do my first radio receiving set, which was Galena, you know, and it was quite an accomplishment to bring into 73rd Street in my room the music and all the rest of the stuff that was on television in those days. And I think we had the billiard table on 73rd on the third floor, and we had a room for the maids and nursing, and it was a happy life. We had many happy occasions there, birthdays and celebrations of all kinds.
Were there any local places you like to go to? Where would you play when you were a youngster?
Well, I was at University School most of the day. I come home after field. The afternoons were field in those days.
What's field?
Well, you played tennis, football, baseball, soccer, whatever, you know. And it was a fine school. We had a football team in 1919, I think it was, when we played the Yale freshmen and beat them. And this was amazing, from a school of classes of 30 to 35 students at the most in the 3 upper grades. So it was 105, they had a choice out of 105 men. Yeah, this was a boys' school, men's school only, no girls, still is. And for a school of our size and everything, to be able to beat the Yale freshman team was quite an accomplishment.
Sounds like one. Do you remember any funny stories about mischief or trouble you got into with your brothers and with your sisters when you were little?
Well, Mill was marvelous to me, and she used to take me to school, and of course she would choke up when she first took me to drop me off. Helene went to a school, but then she was more involved in when we lived on Fairmont, when she went, because it was a very good school called Roxborough School. And then she went to Hathaway Brown. Mildred went to a high school in Cleveland, East High. It was known as the East High School, and they had some very good athletes there. I think Benny Friedman came from there. He played in Michigan, and graduated from Michigan in 1928, I think, or 27. And he was a top quarterback. There was never a quarterback in that the leagues of teams in those days. I'm talking about the three Eastern School, Yale, Princeton, and Harvard, and none of them had a quarterback like he was made every top honor and team chosen by the sport writers in those days.
How do you remember any funny stories though about your sisters or when you were youngsters?
Well, we had a lot of funny stories, but it's hard to put them together because it would sound like nonsense today. I remember, I think it was my 9th or 10th birthday, and Mom had invited Paul Hexter to come over and have birthday dinner with us. And at the end of the evening, she said, "Well, Arthur, are you happy with everything you received?" And I said, "Well, I sort of thought I'd get a bicycle." And sure enough, the bicycle was in the parlor, and they pulled it out from behind something, I don't know what was there, a big chair, and there was my bicycle.
It's a great story. How old were you then? How old do you think you were?
Either 10 or 11, 10 I think.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
You must have been very surprised.
Oh, I was so happy it was. And then Paul Exter taught me how to ride it. And he took me, the end of 73rd Street was a decline to Huff Avenue. And we got up to that point, and he put me, I was on the bicycle. He was either pushing it or instructing me how to make it work. And he said, "Now you're on your own." And I went down this hill, and I got almost to the bottom of that hill, and I realized if I didn't stop it before we got there, I could run into trouble because there was a lot of traffic on Huff Avenue. So I made a turn into an apartment building and went up the drive a bit, and then ran out of steam, and that was the end of it. But at least I controlled it.
Well, that's good.
We had millions of stories in those days because our Nursey, always was protecting us from anything. And she threw a hatchet at Dick Hexter. Of course, she didn't throw it so it would reach him, but she scared the devil out of him. He had been over playing with us or whatever in the backyard, and she didn't like what he was doing, so he said, "You better run or I'm going to get after you." And he took off and ran, and she threw the hatchet at him.
How were you disciplined if you acted up or did something wrong?
I don't think that there was ever a time when my dad was strict with me. There must have been times when he threatened me that if I didn't do this or do that he would spank me. But I can barely remember one occasion when he did that.
Do you remember what you did wrong?
No. But during the course of the years, in those early years, there were a lot of things. I do remember one occasion when I took some crayons and painted and made circles all over one of the walls. And of course the room had to be repapered. And that could have been the occasion.
Okay. Describe the religious atmosphere in your home.
Well, we all went to Sunday school, and we all were confirmed. And both Mom and Pop were involved in the temple in those days, which was Abigail Silver was a rabbi. And Mom went on the board at one time, and then I think it was when she came off, Pop was on the board for. We were very friendly with Rabbi Silver, because he was a young man replacing Rabbi Moses Grease, and we used to have him for lunch on Sundays and all family occasions. He was there.
So you weren't bar mitzvah then?
Oh no, I was confirmed.
And then after you were confirmed, did you attend temple a lot, or just on
Yes,
holidays?
I used to go to my, on the important holidays, both Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, with my dad.
What about on Friday evenings?
We didn't do too much of that until after Dad passed away in 1934, and we would go to a service. It was from 5 to 6 at the temple on 105th Street.
Your first school experiences. You mentioned university school. Did you attend university school your whole?
Yeah, all the way through from the 12th grade to the graduation.
From first grade through graduation?
Yeah. And I had many experiences that were wonderful. I got along well with our class, and I'll never forget in the 3rd grade, they moved in 10 or 12 students, and Teddy Williams sat right behind me, and he poked me in the back, and he said, "We don't need these guys around here." And we had our own group, and we called it the Moose Club, and I was the only one of the Jewish boys that was in the Moose Club.
Did you have meetings, or what was the Moose Club? Just a group of kids you played with all the time?
Well, they were the guys at U.S., only U.S. students. And we had a wonderful group. There were about 8 or 9 of us. I can remember most of the boys, but they're all gone by now. They're all passed away.
Was there any particular subject you enjoyed more than others?
Yes, I liked French, and I liked. I had no specialty subject in those days, but we all got such a wonderful education that every subject was interesting.
Do you remember?
And University School was a great school. We had chapel in the morning, and every student in the school was there except the lower school. They didn't come. The lower school went from the 1st grade to the 6th grade. Then the middle school was the 7th and 8th grade, and then from 9 to 12 was the college, was the high school. And they were known for their record in acceptances at fine colleges for the students.
And still is.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of your teachers? Do any of them stand out?
Yes, I remember my teachers. I remember Miss Stair was a piano teacher, and Mr. Derby was mechanical, and I knew there was a number of them that were very interesting people. And a man by the name of Briggs was the head of the athletics, and he was very, very capable. Maury Briggs. We had the finest families in Cleveland were there. All of the major companies, people that worked for them, their children attended university school in those days.
Did you have any chores around the house that you had to do?
I had no special chores except for when we had the police dog. Hector was his name. and I used to take care of him and be sure that he got fed and everything else. But we always had help in the house. It was a wonderful setup, and we all invited any of our friends to come for meals whenever we would tell Mom, can I invite so-and-so? Oh, by all means invite him. And we had Nursey stayed with us for over 38 years, and she sort of took over a lot of the chores in the house that Mom was doing. And we had always had a chauffeur, and we had a maid and a cook, and it was a wonderful, wonderful living.
What were you like as a child? How would you describe yourself then? What were you like? How would you describe yourself as a child?
Well, I got into a few the usual things. One night the chauffeur was supposed to take me to the Excelsior Club to a dance, and when we got down to 105th Street, I told him that he could leave. And I got in the car and drove the car, and I was 16 years old, and a policeman came after me, and it was a Packard sedan, and maybe it was a limousine in those days. And Bob Grease and Dave Skull were playing bridge on Fairmount Boulevard at our house with their wives, Lucille and Mildred, and they came down, Bob and Dave, and got me out of trouble and took me to the party at the Excelsior, and then I went home with somebody else.
Why did the policeman stop you?
They couldn't see me. I was just a little guy. I was hanging on the steering wheel. But on 73rd Street, Mom and Dad went to California, and they put the car into the paint shop, and it would take a couple of months to paint them in those days. And they bought a Ford sedan. And I used to drive that Ford sedan in the backyard. And I had a cousin by the name of Herbert Klein, and I'd chase him all over the place, and luckily never hit him, but I could have. But it was great living in those days.
Do you remember any bedtime stories that your parents might have told you when you were little?
I'm sure they did, but I don't remember them.
Okay. Do you remember any of your childhood ambitions, what you wanted to be when you grew up?
Well, I wanted to go into the Korach company. It's Pop's business. And when we came back, I don't think I ever told you this, but when I was in college, I told my parents that I would like to go to Europe or South America for my last half of my junior and senior years. And Bill and Dave were going to Europe, so Pop said I should go to Europe, and I went. He got me a job with a commissionaire, and they had all the finest stores in the USA as clients, and also from Germany and from Italy and in Europe. And so I went to Paris in January. I went on the boat, the Mauritania, which was the fastest ship on the ocean at the time. And Bill and Dave and I got to Paris, and they went to one of the fine hotels, and I went to a little hotel around the corner. We got in around 8 o'clock at night. There was no problem. And the next day I went looking for an apartment and found one about very close to the Arc de Triomphe, which was a good neighborhood. The only reason I got the apartment was it was on the first floor, and you had to keep the shutters closed during the day. Well, of course, I was working during the day, so I could keep the shutters closed, and even at night I would keep the shutters closed, but you could still open the windows. And it was a two-room apartment, and I paid $60 a month for it. It had a bedroom and a living room with a day bed in it, and the bedroom, of course, had a bath and everything. And the concierge in the building would bring me breakfast in the morning if I wanted her to. They were very helpful, but I didn't. I would usually get on the subway and go to the office and then get breakfast downtown.
How long were you in Paris for?
Well, I got there in January, and I met
January, what year was this again?
1929.
Okay.
And I loved my work, and I was with a concierge until the last 3 or 4 weeks when I went to a bank, which was acquired by the Chase Manhattan some years afterward. And it was right across the street from the Ritz Bar on Cambon, on Rue Cambon, C-A-B-O-N. And it was quite an education because I would take the buyers to the designer shows, and all the designers in those days gave out cards, and no one else could come in the place except those with the card. And the office would get the cards. And I met a lot of fine people from all over. And they had clients like Berdorf Quinlan and a good store in Buffalo and one in Detroit. Among their clients.
Did you date at all when you were in Paris?
Yes.
Do you remember anybody?
I can remember it like it was yesterday.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about that then?
Well, that was fabulous. There was when I was in Paris, I had a camel hair coat and a trench coat. And the camel hair coat was a sign of either an English or American. And in Place Vendôme, I was walking to the American Express Company to get my mail because I didn't know where I'd be living in Paris, and most of my mail was sent to it was easier to get at the American Express. And on that day that I went over for my mail, I see a man in a camel hair coat with a very attractive lady. And I turned around, and he turned around, and I saw that it was Wink Moore from Cleveland. His brother, Osborne Moore, was in my class, and he was 2 years behind me. His name was Edward Moore, and he introduced me to the girl that he was with, Mary Meadows, whose brother was the governor of Virginia, West Virginia, lived in Beckley, and she was with 2 other girls and a guy from the South who were living on the east bank, on the left bank. And I said to Wink, how long are you here for? He said, I'm here with my dad, but my dad's going to go back to the States, and I'll be looking for a place to live. And I said, well, here's the key. Go out and see whether you like the setup. You can have the day bed in the living room because I have to get up early in the morning and get out. And he, that night, he introduced me to this group that had come over on a ship from the Parsons School of Arts. They went to the Paris division, and I met them. And Mary and I became very good friends. We all traveled together. We went to Spain, to Mallorca, and we just had a wonderful life. We would meet for dinners and all that most of the week, most every evening, unless we had something else to do. And through them, I had met the president, the head of General Electric for all of Europe. And they had a beautiful apartment near the Eiffel Tower. They had 2 apartments, a duplex. They converted it into a duplex. They had their children, 4 children on one floor with a nurse and the help, and they were on the other floor. And we met quite a number of people, and they were nice. They invited us to cocktails and parties and on various occasions. And the second friend I met over there, we were at one of the nightclubs in Paris, in Montmartre, and he was very fond of Mary, my date, and she would never go out with him or anything, but he was very decent to all of us. And he was the head of General Motors for all of Europe, and he had a town car, a chauffeur and a footman, and whenever he would go out of town, he would call me and say, "Artie, you can have the car anytime you want it. You can have the apartment." He had a beautiful apartment, and and we met a lot of people through him. And it was unusual because here he was, the two biggest companies probably in the United States, General Electric and General Motors, and they had all kinds of entree to anywhere. We got invitations for everything, and would include us with their invitation.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you remember, did you meet any French people when you were there?
Yes.
Any French women?
Yes.
Or?
No, I met French people.
Mm-hmm.
I met Mary, I think a week after I had moved in the apartment, or 10 days afterward. And prior to that, I knew a French family and got friendly with them, and also an American family who was there, and I took out their daughters, and that was, I met the French doctor. I had a doctor that was recommended to me by my parents used in Paris. And it was a wonderful life. It was a wonderful experience.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Speaking of doctors, what are your child memory of doctors? Did they come to the house, or did you go to them?
No, the doctors came to the house. We had a family physician by the name of Wagner, and he used to come and he did everything. I think he delivered Pet, and he may have delivered me, I'm not sure. But I know he delivered Pet, and he would come to the house, and because everything in the house, even on 73rd Street, was so good, we had practically the same setup of help, and Mom was known for serving wonderful food, and he'd come in and he'd look at it and say, your stomachs are like slop sinks. But he was a great guy. And then there were no specialists in those days, I don't think. That was the years before the specialists in medicine were.
Did he ever have to make any emergency visits to the house? Or was it mainly just for checkups and things like that?
Oh no, he would come to the house on any occasion. Whenever we called him, he'd come to the house.
What about your dentist? Did you go to the dentist, or did the dentist come to the house?
No, we went to the dentist. And we went to the dentist in the Keith's building. And I looked at the bills after Pop passed away. And I'm not sure, but I vaguely remember that it was $5,000 for each of us. The three of us went there. It was an orthodontist that straightened teeth, you know, I forget what they call it.
$5,000, boy, that's expensive.
Well, you can imagine. In Mill was about 10 years old. I must have been 12 years old, and Pet must have been the same age, around 12 when she went. And it went on until I graduated from U.S. It was a lot of money.
It is a lot of money. When you lost a tooth, did you have a tooth fairy come? Do you remember anything about that at all?
What the?
When you had a tooth, when you lost your tooth, and you had to stick a tooth underneath
Well, we always got a present from the fairy.
Okay.
$1. 10 cents was the first stage. It got up to $1.
That's a lot of money too. Do you remember any crazy neighborhood characters, or any crabby neighbors, or any strange people?
Well, there were a few people that were that way on Halloween and so forth, but they were, on balance, they were all very nice people.
What about Halloween? Do you remember Halloween at all?
Well, we used to go out. I'm sure we went out with the Hexter boys and Lucille Dalby and Jerome Dalby's family. But we never, I don't know that we made too much of it, to be honest with you.
Okay. What about Christmas? Did you celebrate Christmas at all?
Yes, we celebrated Christmas.
Do you have a Christmas tree or anything
No,
like that?
we had no tree. We had a small tree in the nursery. A very small tree. But we did celebrate Christmas and all the holidays. And we got Christmas presents and everything else.
And Hanukkah too?
I don't remember. I'm sure we had Hanukkah when we went to Sunday school. At that age, we celebrated Hanukkah.
I'm gonna turn this backlight on too, just to see what happens.
Something wrong?
No, I think it's okay. I think it's just focusing a lot. Maybe that might help it a little bit more.
You want to leave the light on?
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it on. I think it's doing okay. Yeah, that should be good.
I can clearly remember Fairmount Boulevard much easier because Mill had confirmation, and we had we celebrated that in the house. That was one of the first occasions in the house. And I think she was the first class of Rabbi Silver.
What about Thanksgiving?
Oh yeah, we always had a wonderful Thanksgiving.
You always had it at the house?
Yeah, oh yes.
Do you remember 4th of July at all? Was there anything?
No, we had fireworks. I think we had them at the house, but I'll tell you a few things that I do remember that stand out in my mind. On 73rd Street, we had neighbors, Lottie and Ike Garson. They were next to us on one side. I don't remember the name of the neighbors on the other side of us, but we put a fence up and we put a door in the fence so they could walk through that and come to our house without going around the front. And we were very friendly with them. They were marvelous people, and they had two daughters, Rachel and Marion. And Marion used to come over and have breakfast with us, and she'd eat the food that we were supposed to eat. But anyway, I do remember that on Armistice Day, I was a Boy Scout, and we went up to the corner, and there was a big parade up Euclid Avenue from downtown to uptown. And my job was to hold the ropes to keep the people from running out on the street when the parade went by. But I do recall many occasions like that because they were very important. I remember World War I can remember when we went into it, but I didn't know much about it. I was a young man, still 7 years old. How much could I remember? But I do remember when we celebrated 1918.
The end of the war.
Yeah.
What about your family vacations when you were little? Do you remember any of those?
Yes, I remember we went to one of the first trips I remember is we went to Maine to pick up Mill at camp. She was at AAA camp and she wasn't too happy there. And we went with the Aaron Skulls, Aaron and Bertha Skull. Their son was at camp in Maine, and we drove tandem, the two cars, and we get to a steep hill, and the roads were such that we get out of the car, and let the chauffeur drive the car down, and then we'd walk up on the other side of the hill, and he'd pick us up because it was scary. Very narrow roads. They were mostly dirt roads, very few macadam roads. And Bob Skull was at Kennebec, I remember that. And we went to Poland Springs, and we had several stops on the way. And it was a marvelous trip. And then on another trip, we went east when Mill announced her engagement to Dave. And we drove, I think this was in 1923. It was in 23. And we drove to New York and went via Arkville, New York, where Uncle Bertie and Aunt Nellie, Mom's oldest brother, had a summer home. The summer home is still there. Beautiful place. And we went to New York and Washington. I remember the trip, and it was a very fine trip. I do recall, this is a funny story, I think you'll get a kick out of it. We were going from Cleveland to Akron practically 3 or 4 times a year to visit my father's uncle Emil Korach and Lillian and their son Edward, and also Jerome and Pearl Dowby and their 2 daughters. And we would, Mrs. Scoville always sat on the porch, and she would watch us leave, and she would be there when we came home. She would always worry about us when we were gone, because it would take about 3 or 4 hours, the round trip. We'd go for lunch, and then we'd leave shortly after lunch and come back to 73rd Street. Then we took a trip to Cincinnati to visit Uncle Max and Lillian and Aunt Lillian Davis. She was a sister of my mother, and they had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls. And we drove that down there. I was, I think, 12 years old, and maybe I was only 11. And when we were on Sundays in Cleveland, we would go over to see Grandpa and Grandma Korach at their house in the city in those days, and I would sit between my dad's legs and drive the car. And then when we went on the trip, we went over at all dirt roads, and we went over a terrible bump, and Mom hit her head on the wood that held the canvas top in place on the open touring car, and she started to scold Pop for going over this bump. Well, of course, he didn't see the bump, and he said, "Arthur, you drive," and I drove the car.
How old were you then?
I was 11 or 12. And I was hanging onto the steering wheel because I couldn't sit back in the car. You didn't have adjustable seats or anything. And I didn't drive it long, maybe for 40, 50 minutes, until everybody calmed down after the big bump. And we had Marguerite Korach with us. She was the youngest of all the girls in Pop's family, and actually she was the youngest in the family, and she would go with us on some of these trips. She wasn't married yet, and she was a young lady. She enjoyed it. And when we went to Akron, as I told you, it would take a couple of hours because the roads were so bad, and you get flat tires and all this. They're much more frequent than they are any tires we have today or you had years ago. But it was all fun, and we enjoyed it.
Was there one vacation that you really stands out that was the best vacation, or?
They were all great.
They were all great.
Yeah.
I
used to go to Arkville, New York, to my uncle's house
Mm-hmm.
for 3 weeks in the summers. And I would go with Pop to New York, and then Uncle Bertie and I would take the train to either Kingston or Poughkeepsie, and spend the night in the hotel, and the chauffeur from Arkville would come down and pick us up in the morning. And I just love those occasions at Arkville, because there were Carl Erf and his wife Dorothy and their children, and Armand Erf, who was a bachelor, and Rainey. They were all brilliant people. And Elsa Daggett, Elsa Blum Daggett. She married Blum first and then married Daggett. And she had a son, Dick, who is now living in Zimbabwe, Africa. I keep in correspondence with him. A wonderful guy. And he's a few years younger than I am, maybe 3 years younger than I am. And he has a son and a daughter. The daughter was killed in an automobile accident. Very sad, some years ago. I think 10 or 15 years ago. And the son is still there.
In Cleveland?
In Cape Town.
Cape Town.
Africa, South
Okay.
Africa. And he is an engineer, a specialist in boats and so forth. Got a wonderful business.
What kind of things did your family have around the house to read when you were growing up? Magazines, books? Did you read a lot?
Yes, we had a good library. All the books that you would recall. A book of knowledge, and some history books. But as we grew up, at university school we had a wonderful library, and a good public library, so we would get books there if we wanted them.
Well, do you remember your favorite book, or does any book stand out when you were younger?
Yeah, the Swift brothers was the books that the boys read in those days, And they were quite something. They come out with a new book every year, or two, one or two new books a year. And it ended up with, I think I must have ended up with 10 or 12 of those books. And they, by the time I got to be 14 or something, and then we gave them away.
Did you subscribe to any magazines?
Yes, the National Geographic magazine. And of course, I think Time was founded in Cleveland, but that wasn't founded until 1924 or 5. But there were other magazines that we had. I don't remember the titles anymore. But mostly the National Geographic.
How about music? Was there any music that your family liked to listen to, or was anybody talented?
Well, they would go to, not frequently, infrequently, because Pop was in New York almost every other week. I mean, every month at least. And they would go occasionally to the Masonic, which is now the hall on 40th Street in Euclid Avenue, I think it's the Masonic, where Jeff graduated from.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a play, and I think Helene was in it too, that was a benefit play at and they had it there at the Masonic Temple, and with grown-up Clevelanders. I can remember the Moss family, Herman Moss family, were our parents in this play, and then there were other occasions, be something at one of the schools that they would go to, my parents. Musicals or whatever.
What about dancing? What was your attitude towards dancing?
Well, Mildred's friends taught me how to dance. I went to dancing school at Excelsior Club at one point in my life before I went to college. And it was always an enjoyable occasion. As a youngster, I do remember that Mildred was going to dancing school, and I went to the place in the afternoon, I think it was, to pick her up. And I slid on the floor and banged my head against the floor. My feet skidded out from under me because it was so polished. But I do remember that occasion. Then I had an occasion when I was very young, about 4 or 5 years old, when we had a chauffeur by the name of Earl, and I was sitting in the front seat with him in the Peerless car, and fell out of the car and landed on the streetcar line, and cut my upper forehead. And of course he came and got me right away and took me to the hospital. Or took me to the doctor. They could patch it up a little bit. But that was the most I remember of occasions like that. When I was in college, Mom and Pop went to Europe in October, or September, right, in those days. They would go almost every year at that time. And I called up the chauffeur at home, told him to put the car on the ship to Detroit. It was a Chrysler Roadster, and I wanted to go to Chicago for a date. And he did what I'd asked him to do. And I got the car, I went down and picked the car up in Detroit, took the bus over, and there were three other men in the fraternity and I that we're going to make the trip, and we're going to stop at Valparaiso, Indiana on the way, where one of the guys lived, John Lowenstein. And en route, we got into a terrible accident. It was raining, and there was a lumber truck ahead of me, and I tried to get around him and went in the ditch. The two guys in the rumble seat, of course, took the brunt of the problem, and they were there for about a month in Indiana, and I used to go by train from Ann Arbor almost every weekend while I was there to see them. And that was a horrible situation. I mean, I came back and I went to see my dean and told him what had happened, how it happened, and he said, don't worry about it. You just go ahead with your work and do the best you can.
What happened to them? Do you remember what
Yeah,
the injuries were?
well, one had a concussion, and they both were pretty badly hurt. I mean, there were a few cuts on their faces. But I think they both had a concussion. But luckily, it came out of it.
Oh, that's good.
Everything turned out well.
Think back to a typical Saturday or Sunday in your family when you were growing up. Can you just reminisce a bit and tell me about what an average Sunday was like in your home? What time you might have gotten up, what you did, what you ate?
Well, in those days, in the early days, of course, we stayed home and played and did whatever we wanted to do in the yard, 73rd Street. And then when we, after we were finished with Sunday school, we would sleep in the morning on Sundays. Saturdays, I would go to the football games at University School, was down the street from us. And they were always, and sporting events of that type. Later on in life, Danny Dalby, who was who had a speech problem, a speech and hearing problem. He couldn't speak, and it was difficult for him to hear. He would read lips, and he was a very close friend of mine, and his mother and mom were closest friends. And of course, I had to put myself out for him, which I did. And I would go to the baseball games with him in League Park in Cleveland before the stadium was built.
And who would you see? Do you remember any of the players?
Yes, I remember quite a bunch of them. Of course, Babe Ruth.
Did you see Babe Ruth
Oh,
play?
yes. And Joe DiMaggio, all of them came, but that was even a little later than the early guys. There were wonderful players in the early days of baseball. And this is sort of interesting. The World Series, when it was in Cleveland one year, I think in 1918, and I was at University School on Huff Avenue, and we could hear everything that was going on at the game, because the noise level was very high. When anybody hit a homer or something, there'd be a lot of excitement. And even if we weren't at the game, we could almost tell what was happening. And then, of course, at the end of the game, we would get it by radio. We would hear it by radio.
Do you remember if the Indians won that year?
I think they did.
Something I'll never see. What about family pets? Did you ever have any dogs or cats?
Well, we always had something on, not so much on 73rd. We had Dave Skoll bought two police dogs, one that they had at their house and one we had at our house.
German Shepherds?
A German Shepherd.
Any particular reason why?
No, we just
Just they were pets, though. They weren't really guard dogs.
No, but we built a pen in the backyard for the dog.
Do you remember his name?
Hector.
Was he fun to play with?
Well, he was a great dog. I'll never forget, one day I came home from school. I used to take the streetcar home. And I went to the garage, the backyard rather, and Hector was in the garage on a basket of some kind, a blanket of some kind. He had run out on Fairmount Boulevard. Somebody had hit him with a car, and his leg was broken. And of course, we took him to
To the vet?
doctor, the animal doctor.
The veterinarian?
Pardon?
Veterinarian?
The vet. I mean the vet.
Yeah.
And the vet fixed him up, but he came out walking as much as to say, "Look what happened to me." And it was a sad occasion, but he got well.
Well, that's good. That's good. So you pretty much lived in those two houses, East 73rd and then Fairmount, right?
Yeah.
That was it.
And we always had, if there were business people coming to Cleveland, we would always have them at the house for lunch on Sunday. They came on Sunday. There were two guys I remember very well, the Foremans from Rochester and the Weinbergs from Dunkirk. And the father and the son would come, and they'd work with Pop and I would go with them to the factory, and then they'd come to our house for lunch, and we'd go to a movie in the afternoon, and then they would go back to Rochester or Dunkirk.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot today. We've been doing it for an hour. Do you want to stop?
No, we can keep going.
Want to go for a little bit more?
Sure.
Do you want to take a little break?
No, I'm fine.
Stretch out? Okay.
I'm trying to think of some of the occasions. Our Fairmount Boulevard home was the most comfortable place. We each had our own bedroom, and the two girls shared a bathroom. I had a bathroom, and Mom and Pop had a bathroom. And we had two sleeping porches. One was off their bedroom, Mom and Pop's, and one was off my bedroom. And I could have 3 guys sleep there over the weekend with me.
A sleeping porch was actually screened in or something?
No, it was all built in,
Uh-huh.
and it had windows on the west side, and inner-door beds on the 2 walls. And when I was in college and before I went to college, I would have guys coming, spending the night. Always had one fella in Cleveland when I was in high school, and we would take turns. I'd go to their house the next weekend and so forth. And when Mom and Pop went out of town, Alfred Farber and John Cooter, who were my closest friends, would come over and spend the night. And then I would do it the next weekend when their parents were away. And we'd always have a little party, there were 7 girls and 6 boys in our group, and we always went together.
How old were you then?
15, 16 years old.
No, you wouldn't drink or anything like that then.
Not at that age. We did drink during Prohibition. When I was 16.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about that? That must have been hard to get liquor then, wasn't it?
Well, you couldn't get any liquor, but Pop was very far-sighted and had a tremendous wine cellar and whiskeys and so forth. But we didn't drink very much, of course.
Was that legal for him to have that all in storage?
No. It was legal for him to have it because it was bought before Prohibition, but there were bootleggers in those days. And Pop said to me, you don't have to go to the bootlegger. Whenever you want anything, you just take it out of the liquor cabinet, out of the liquor cellar, in the basement on Fairmount Boulevard. And we had racks built specially for the wine and so forth, and shelves for the whiskeys and beer and God knows what else.
Did he have a lot? He must have had a lot in storage.
He did. He had
It had to
tremendous.
last how long? How long was Prohibition?
Prohibition started in 1918, I think. Yes, 1918. And my dad was in California, and he called his uncle, Emil Korach, in Akron, and told him to load up on everything, which he was in the liquor business at that time, and which he did. He loaded up on it, and then brought it over to Fairmount Boulevard. But we never had to go to a bootlegger. The only time we did when probably one of the most fun times was when I was 21 in October of 1928. And Dave and Pop drove to Ann Arbor. And the night of my stag, it was on a Saturday night, and we were all in Detroit at the Statler Hotel, and we had a suite up on the top floors, and then we had a private dining room, and several of my friends from Cleveland came to Detroit, and I think we were either 20 or 25 guys, all of the fellows at college that I wanted in the fraternity house, and the ones from Cleveland that came. And we had a marvelous time.
Do you remember what you did?
Yeah, we had dinner and a lot of drinks. Eddie Keith was the bartender. No, not the bartender. He owned a bar in Detroit, and he was our bootlegger. And I ordered the booze from him, and we had a very good time. I got terribly drunk, as did most of the guys, and we played bridge. And then after the bridge game, around 12 o'clock, I went upstairs to bed. And these guys came and picked me up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had to get dressed again and go out with them, which I did.
You must have been exhausted.
Nobody got exhausted in those days. Anyway, that was a wonderful occasion. And of course, we had house parties in Ann Arbor, and I never forget one day, I used to take care of the liquor for the house parties, and I had Eddie Keith come over for lunch, which he did before the party, and brought the liquor over, and that particular day we had hot chocolate for lunch, and he loved it so much he didn't know what it was. And he used to come over, and whenever he came over, I always have hot chocolate for him during the meal. But the boys all bought their booze from Eddie. And then we had an occasion, I'm trying to remember, we had so much fun at Ann Arbor. The upperclassmen had cars. I didn't have any the first year. The only time I had a car was when my junior year I had a Ford A. That was a new Ford model. Succeeded the T, Ford T model. It had a gear shift. It was a coupe with a rumble seat. And I used to, the excuse for having it was that I would go in and call on some customers in Detroit and in the Michigan area for the Korach company. And I got permission to have the car.
Did you use it a lot to call
Oh,
in
sure.
customers too?
I used it for that, but I used it also for social reasons. It was great having a car in college. And when I went to college, my first year, Ralph Cole had a car that he and Andy Goodman had bought together the year before. And Paul Ginsberg had a car, and it was a lot of fun. We'd go into Detroit for the Saturday night, go to the Statler, or later on the Book Cadillac Hotel, and we'd go to the nightclubs, and it was a lot of fun and very entertaining.
It sounds like lots of fun.
In Ann Arbor, it was a wonderful time in my life, and I enjoyed it immensely. I met a lot of good friends, and the girls, there was one girl on the campus. She was the prettiest thing there, and she lived my freshman year in the building next to me, the house next to me. I had a rooming house, and she had a rooming house. And she was a member of a very top sorority. And of course, everybody that saw her wanted to date with her. But she was very particular, and she only had a few guys that she went out with, and I would happen to be one of them.
What was her name?
I can't remember her name. I can remember her, but I can't remember her name. But when I was in Europe, Mom and Pop and Helene came over to pick me up, and it was toward the end of June when they got there. And then we traveled. They brought the Lincoln car over, and we had an accident of the Lincoln car and taking it off the ship. And Pop was up watching it, but I wasn't. I was still sleeping. It came down on one of those, what do they call them, these steel turnstiles, where they tied the ship up when it came to shore with heavy rope. And this thing hit the car where the gear shift, the transmission was. It landed there. But now look, the outside of the car and the car itself was in perfect condition. And you go in and the gear shift was all ruined and everything. And this is an interesting story. Pop very, very advisedly took insurance out on the car. Am I too far over?
No, you're fine.
And the car, we couldn't use the car, so we rented a car and we went to Hamburg, where the ship landed in Cuxhaven. We got over to Hamburg where the zoo was, and we spent a day there, and we went to the office of the shipping company, and they couldn't tell us anything too much. They admitted that it was their fault, that the ropes that were used to bring the car down on the pier had broken, and that they admitted that it was their fault. In the meantime, we were stuck there in Germany, so Pop told him the story first on the ship, and then in Hamburg, and then we went to Berlin, and I memorized the story in German. And we would go to the office in Berlin, where the steamship company was, and my father would say in German, "Now my son will tell you what happened to the car," and I would go right through it. But if they interrupted me in the middle of it, I would be stuck. I'd have to start from the beginning again. And I told the whole story about the. Come in.
Come in.
It's 12:30. I guess I want to find out.
I think we should.
But anyway, make a long story short, we hired a car, a Mercedes-Benz, and a chauffeur, and we went to Czechoslovakia, down through Germany, through Dresden, and that area, the south part of Germany, into Czechoslovakia, which is formerly Hungary, and we visited. When we got to Hungary, we visited my father's birthplace and his grandfather's farm that was owned by a German count. And the German count and my father used to play together when they were little kids. So the count had a tea for us in the afternoon, which was very nice. And we all went there, 4 of us, and his family was there, and my grandfather, and my father's grandfather, my great-grandfather, worked for this count, for his father. And my grandfather lived on the property in a small bungalow, and like a gatehouse. But it wasn't attached to the gate, it was separated from the gate. And that's when he was first married, that's where he lived. And then, as you've probably heard before, my father's mother passed away in childbirth.
Yeah, we covered that. I remember you telling me all about that.
And
then he married her sister.
Yeah, and then I think they may have moved, but that was a wonderful trip. We went.
What happened to the Lincoln then?
Well, the Lincoln, this is quite a story.
As I remember, the insurance was with
Frankel Brothers.
Okay.
Insurance was.
I remember this story.
Yeah. And we went after we finished our trip through Czechoslovakia and the mountains and the resorts and whatnot, and the family graveyard, which the attendant at the cemetery who we got, he was I think an old Jewish man, maybe he had been, and very religious. And when we left the cemetery that day, he turned to me and he says, "You're probably the last of anybody of your family that'll be here, and I want you to take the key," which I still have.
I know you do.
Anyway, we got to Vienna, we went to Budapest, which was marvelous, and then we went to Vienna, which was even greater, because we met the Hayeses and Henry Heiner and 2 friends of mine, Bunny Stern and Bob Rosenberg. And there were several girls traveling alone. One of the funny stories was that when I went to the swimming pool in Budapest, it had waves in it. They created waves there. It was a marvelous setup. And there were 2 young ladies sitting together. And when it came noontime, I went over to them and I said, "Are you waiting for anybody, or would you like to have lunch?" And they said, "We're supposed to be meeting 2 friends here that we met on the ship." And I said, "What were their names?" And he told me. I said, "If they're not here now, they'll never show up." It was Bob Rosenberg and Bunny Stern, good friends of mine. And so I took them to lunch. And we got to Vienna. We had a wonderful time in Vienna, and I have pictures which I gave you of the European trip. We were with the Hayeses and also with the, Max Rafalski, who was married to Bob Hayes' mother. Remember her name? I do. She was a lovely lady. And Carrie and Marie had a friend with her, and she was married to Heiner at that time, to Henry. And I think we had about a week in Vienna. And it wasn't too long, it was perfect. There was enough to do and see, and which we did. And Dad said to me, or I said to Pop, I think it'd be smart if I would go to Vienna a day ahead of you all to make sure that everything is in order. So I flew over in the Fokker plane, that's in the movies too, from Vienna to Berlin, and I went to the garage where the car was being repaired. And on the second floor of the garage, in an area that must have been 50 feet by 50 feet, 250 square foot, was every single part with a tag on it. So I turned to the head of the garage and I said to him, "Do you have a chassis here?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, mount our body and tires, wheels, and everything on the new chassis," which they did. And they had the car ready the next day.
Oh boy.
I think the chassis cost us about $5,000, but it was insured. I had called Henry Frankel in Cleveland to make, we had cabled them, and then we had a cable back to go ahead and at any cost and get the car fixed. So there was no problem with it. And the next day we started off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to go down the Rhine, and we didn't have a driver. Pop and I drove. And by 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, we came right back to where we started in Berlin. We got off the road and went back to the Adelon. And then we took a chauffeur the next day and kept him until we got to Switzerland and then sent him back. But that was a great trip and a lot of fun. We went to Italy, we went to Switzerland, southern France, Paris, drove riding the whole way, never got lost or anything.
How long was this trip? How many weeks?
Well, we were gone for, we didn't come back till after Labor Day. It was about July, August, and a few days in September. We took the ship back. It was great. It was the American Line, one of the largest ships afloat. I think it was the U.S. I'm not sure of the name. But we came back to New York, where Mill and Dave met us, and then they went back to Cleveland on the train, and Dave and I drove the Lincoln back to Cleveland. We were driving at 90 miles an hour and got a flat tire. And Dave was driving, and Dave was a big man and could hold it on the road, which he did. And of course, we were talking back and forth to each other. I had the emergency brake in my hand. I was slowing it up gradually from 90 miles an hour. And when we finally got the car stopped, the tire was torn into threads, but didn't bother us because we had two spares in the fenders of the car. It was a beautiful car, very, very comfortable. It had a place for 5 people, and it was not a sedan. It was another name. They called it a coach, I think it was. And it had 2 seats that you could pull out of the front seat that came down as extras, and three places in the back seat of the car for passengers. And we kept that car until from 1929 to 1935 or 36, and it was as beautiful a day we got rid of it as the day we bought it.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
No, it was really kept up, and I had all the nickel changed to chrome so that it wouldn't deteriorate. We had it painted a few times, and then I bought a Cadillac for Mom, Cadillac sedan. Maybe I bought a Buick first, and then I bought a Cadillac. Yes, I did. I bought a Buick sedan first, and then we traded that in for the Cadillac sometime in 1936, in that period, 36 to 38. And we kept that for a long time.
Why don't we take a break and have lunch?
All right.
Because we
Now,
have
what do you do
tomorrow.
here?
I'm going to just turn it off. But we can watch the last few seconds of this to see how it came out, okay?
Tony, this has been wonderful. I just hope I remembered everything to tell you.
Well, there's a lot more to tell me, so we can work on it.
All right.
Today is the 28th of July, isn't it?
Yeah, 28.
1991.
Right.
Okay. We're all set.
Good.
Did you think of anything that, since we spoke, that you wanted to bring up, maybe?
Well, I want to confine it to the family.
Okay, let's try to do that. Well, one of the things that I wanted to ask you, I have a mark here, was how important in life do you think a person's social class is?
If they are aggressive and do the right things for the community, there's no limit. If they are selfish and spend a lot of money, they can be criticized. I said to you, Tony, that you can't buy class. Class is something you're born with. And if it's used, and if you take advantage of it and understand it, it can be very helpful in life.
Do you think it makes a difference what social class a person is born into?
No, I really don't. It's difficult for the person, but it isn't that harmful if they have the intelligence and desire to improve themselves. It's like a business, you know. You go after it, and you can do it well.
What are the important things in life, the real important things?
Well, I would say that the real important things in life are happiness, number one, health, goes hand in hand with happiness. I have friends that they just suffer from various things, and they make the most of it. I mean, they make the best of it, and they can continue to enjoy their life. But it's a terrific handicap when you're not well. God forbid that should happen to any of us in this family.
Well, you've been very strong in the last year or 2 years since you've been.
Well, I'm not talking about today. I mean, I have a desire to go on, to live on, and that's very important. You try and do everything you possibly can to do it. It's unfortunate that I have to go to dialysis 3 days a week, but if there's no choice, I have to do it the rest of my life, and I might just as well take it as best I can. And there's nothing else that can be done about it.
That's right. Do you remember any of your heroes during your teenage years?
Well, yes, there was always particularly in the years from 14 to 18 or 20, there were heroes, guys that I wanted to or hoped to be like and accomplish what they did. And but I would say that during my lifetime, I've made a lot of friends all over this country and also in Europe. And that friendship, even though it dates back 60, 70 years, is still alive in many instances. And I've been very grateful for it. I'll tell you, this is a cute story. A dear friend of mine in Baltimore who was widowed, her husband died in February, I think it was, or early March, of cancer. And the other night, she had a dinner party for me, and she called the occasion Artie's Army. And it was a beautiful affair. There were only 14 of us, I think, all seated around the dining room table. And she just kept talking about Artie's Army. They all wished me the best. And I was very flattered by that thoughtfulness. All young people, none of my friends, all of them my friends, but not people that we see all the time.
Sure.
But I know them well, and knew their parents well, and knew everything about them. And it couldn't have been nicer. But these things keep a person going when the going gets tough. I have friends that call in here. I have business friends that call in, talk about other things. They don't even know that I'm sick or have any problem. And they call in to find out how I am, talk about their business. And I always believe very strongly in making good friends of anybody that I was connected with, whether they be business or whether they be social or whoever. And they all, most of them, turned out to be very important people, whether it be in Wall Street or in their own cities or business or whatever. Lawyers, many people all over.
Well, that's good. My next question is about your teenage years. Did you have a job when you were in high school? Do you remember? Did you work at all? Or?
I can remember exactly. The first job I had was in a specialty store called Stearns in Cleveland on Euclid Avenue next to the Union Commerce Building. And I worked there for a few days at Christmas time. I was selling ice skates in the toy department. And there were a couple of my friends there too. And I still have the envelope with my payroll in it. The pay I received.
Do you remember how much it was?
I think it was $16 or $18.
For how long?
Oh, 3 days or 4 days. But I sold a lot of skates. And Mom my mother put the envelope in her safe deposit box and gave it to me many years later. Then I worked at the Korach company in the summers. I worked for 2 or 3 summers when I was in high school and when I got my first, when I was in high school, that's right. And then my freshman year at college, I came back from school and my dad said to me, what did I want to do this summer? And I said to him, I'd like to go on the road and sell. And they had a salesman in Texas who took sick or something and wasn't available to make his trip. So my dad said, would you like to go to Texas? I said, I'd love it. But I have to go to the dentist, and I have to do a few things to get ready for it, which I did. And I left on a Friday night and went to St. Louis, got there on a Saturday morning. In the meantime, my mother and a few other friends had arranged so that I would have a nice weekend in St. Louis, because Monday morning I would start on the trip. And I had a trunk with the samples in it, and I had my own luggage and all that. And most salesmen traveled by car. It was much easier for them to do it that way. And when I got to St. Louis, I went out. I was invited for lunch and go to the ball game, and then in the evening for dinner at Sally, I can't think of their maiden name, Sally May. Her father was president of the May Company, and I went to their house, the May's house, on Sunday for lunch. And I can't recall what I did for dinner. Maybe I went back to the hotel and started prepping up for the next day. And I started off on the train with a truck and everything else, and I was gone for 6 weeks. And while I was gone, while I was away on the trip, I met a lot of nice people. And when I got to Houston, Texas, I met one of the buyers who was related to the owners, and he set up an appointment for me at Kirby, Block and Fisher, which was a buying office in New York. And he wanted me to show the merchandise to Mr. Block. So when I got back to Cleveland, my dad sent me to New York to see Mr. Block, and he said, don't you go in that building, because if you come in with don't you go in the rear elevators, you go up the front elevators, and they won't let you take any packages up in the front. So I went over first and went up the front elevator. I made my appointment with Mr. Block, and he came. I then went to his office and showed him the samples, but I was treated like a gentleman, not like a huckster. which they did in New York in those days. And we got an order for 4 of the styles. It was a trial order that they were going to send out to their buying office clients, and I think it totaled either somewhere between 1,100 and 1,500 units.
That's a big
It's
order.
a big order. And that taught me the lesson that whenever I did business with any store or any group of stores, I would go directly to the head of the company and start from there.
It's easier to start at the top and work your way down.
Yeah. And that went on the entire time in my career, both at Joseph Weiss and L. Wright and Brothers.
Do you remember your first girlfriend?
Yeah, I told you, I think yesterday, when we talked about it last, there were 7 gals and 6 boys. And I used to take out one of the girls, and then
Who was that?
that was Elizabeth Deutsch and Mary Janowitz. They were my 2 good dates. And then, because I was small, I was usually paired up with the smallest in the group of girls, and that was Marion Bing Garrison. And I used to take her out frequently.
And she's still close friends with you.
Yeah, still a close friend.
I'm gonna skip over some of this stuff.
I think that's smart.
And let's get in. I'm kind of curious, what about your political beliefs and your parents' political beliefs when you were younger? Do you remember?
Well, I don't think that political beliefs in my early years were as keen with my parents or with me as they are today. In those days, commencing in 1916 with First World War I, a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, was the president, and the country backed him. And then we went back to, I think my father leaned toward the Republican Party, and we then voted for Republican presidents. But my first voting for president was for FDR, who the country was in a terrible slump, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he had a great deal of reforms which he put into action, and all the way from jobs for public properties, trying to get the industry to cooperate, and obviously it worked, and worked well. And that was in 1932.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about college. You went to Michigan. Do you remember leaving home? Do you remember how you got to college?
Yeah, I took the train to college.
How many years did you attend Michigan?
Pardon?
Did you go to Michigan for 4 years?
No, I went to 2.5 years, and spent the last 9 months in Paris, and that was because of the business. But I think we discussed this.
Yeah, we discussed a little. Did you graduate from Michigan or
No,
did you?
it's a year and a half.
Let's see. Were you a good student?
No, I wasn't a good student, but I managed to get by.
Okay. Were you ever in the military? Weren't you in the Navy or something?
While I was in New York, when we moved to New York in 1938, Carrie and I and Jeannie. I started with Joseph and Feist in 1936, working in a Cleveland plant, and then I went on the road as a salesman with as a helper with one of the salesmen, carried his sample cases and so forth. And we went to Pittsburgh the first Sunday. We left Cleveland on a Saturday and got to Pittsburgh on a Sunday, so that evening, and set up Sunday. And he was a very nice gentleman, and he let me go to work with several of the customers, and I think we had either 30 or 40 customers in that one day. And I got my first road experience with him. And when I went back to Cleveland the next year, they gave me the fall line, the spring line it was, yeah. Spring line was coming out then. And they told me to go to Missouri and Kansas, which I did. In those days, there was one firm called Curlee, and they controlled the business in that area. And every city I would drive into, there was a big Curlee sign. And my competition it was very tough competition. They had 3 salesmen in the territory. And when they gave me the figures, they gave me a quota to shoot for. And the quota was for 2 trips of summer and spring goods. And I thought the quota was for the 1 trip, so I did better than the quota for the 1 trip. And so my second trip was a very easy one, and they were very pleased, and they said to me, do you want to be in the merchandising and sales, or do you want to be in the factory? And I chose the merchandising and sales, and that was headquartered in New York. So so that's why we moved to New York. And I'm grateful that I made that choice, because that's where that's where the business was. And I became very efficient in merchandising and all that. And by 1941, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, I was at the football game at the Giants Stadium. And they announced over the loudspeakers that they paged a general in the stadium. And when they did this, we all suspected that something was wrong, although we had no reason to believe it. And sure enough, on the way, it was Pearl Harbor, and I became an air raid warden in the area where we lived, along with all my friends who did the same thing.
How old were you then?
I was
1941.
41, 07.
34 years old.
34 years old, that's right.
And you were living with Carrie and Jeannie in New York?
Yeah. In New York, on the corner of 96th Street and Madison Avenue. We had a duplex. It was a lovely apartment. And we had a nurse and a cook, maid. A cook, that's right. And by the end of December, 3 weeks later, I had a meeting with Felix Mayer in New York, and I said someone's going to have to be in Washington to get military contracts, we were not going to be able to get any piece goods to make suits. Everything would be war production. And he went to Cleveland, he came back, and he said, we made you a vice president, and you will be the one to go to Washington, which I did. And I went every Monday night on the train to Washington from New York, and covered a lot of area. In those days, a taxi zone was 20 cents a zone, and my taxi bill would be $8, going between the Army and the Navy. Well, we ended up with the biggest Navy contract that was ever written, and it's in the record annals of purchasing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in Washington. And when in August of 1942, the commander who gave me who I worked with on the contract, came to Cleveland to see the factory and so forth. And we were driving out in Dave Scull's station wagon from my home from his home in Fairmount Boulevard, and picked up Felix at the Wade Park Manor, and went to the factory. And on the way going between the Wade Park Manor and the Joseph Feist Company, Commander Dono, who was the one we worked with, said to Felix, I'm going to say something that you're not going to like, but we want to get Hardy in the Navy. And Felix said it's up to him to do whatever he wants to do.
Why did they want to get you in the Navy?
To run the program.
Oh, the clothing program?
Yeah, it was known as the Naval Uniform Service.
Okay.
And so I chose to go in the Navy, and this was in August, and Dave Scull had gone down to Florida in the Air Force training, and they had a home after he graduated in Pinehurst, South Carolina. I was down there for the weekend, and I came back into the office early in the morning because the train got in at 7 o'clock. Went right to the office, and while I was there, before anybody else came in, it was the commander on the phone that I should come to Washington the next day, Tuesday. Labor Day was Monday, and Tuesday was the day I was in the office. Come down right the next day on Wednesday for a physical and so forth, which I did. And I was commissioned in the Navy October 17th, and went into active duty that day, or a week later. I think we had a few days, extra days. And I first went to Washington and to meet the commander, and Sam Peary of Carson Peary Scott in Chicago, the big department store, was the other guy chosen. And the two of us were working on this program. And they sent Sam to New York to work, and they sent me to San Francisco. And I had travel tickets that I would write myself for a radius of 3,500 miles of San Francisco. And I was in San Francisco for a year, came east, and they reassigned me to another big naval job. And that was the ammunition depot in Hastings, Nebraska. There were two sister ships, as they called them. It was a beautiful 400-acre setup, and they had loading depot from 40 millimeter to 16-inch major caliber, and they had something like 30 buildings on this acreage, hundreds of miles of railroad siding, and all of our stuff went to Japan, the Far East. I mean, went to the Far East, and and the other Stillwater, Oklahoma, their stuff went to the Europe. And I was there for a year and a half, and then when peace was declared, I was in the Navy for 3 years. When peace was declared, I was still in Nebraska, and was among the first to request inactive duty, so I get out of the Navy.
How often would you see Carrie and Jeannie when you were in the Navy?
Well, I went to New York. The first summer, and I'm 43. No, in 42. And then I went there for a month or 6 weeks. No, that wasn't the time. That was just for a long weekend. And I would go to Cleveland to see Mom. And I would get there maybe 3-4 times a year.
A lot of letter writing?
Yeah. I have the file with all the letters.
I'm sure you do. Did you ever expect that you might have to see combat? Were you ever nervous about that?
Well, I didn't. I was a line officer, and a line officer could do anything, but I had no naval training at any of the training schools. And I was 35 years old when I went in the Navy, and that's pretty old, and they don't do too much with guys that age.
What was your mom's reaction to you joining the Navy? Was she surprised?
Well, she was surprised, and she was concerned, I'm sure, but I don't think she had to worry because I was in touch with her all the time.
Was that real difficult for you being in the Navy? I'm sure you were a little bit spoiled by, the good life, and then all of a sudden you were sleeping with in barracks, or were you?
You won't believe what happened. When I got to San Francisco, they had no accommodations, and it was a big Navy town. There was a lot of activity in Oakland and also in the city. And I had a wonderful captain, and he didn't know my job because I never had anything like that in the Navy before. But I used to use his office, and he would pick me up in the morning. I got a room at the two friends of mine. They got me a room at the big hotel, the St. Francis Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And I paid $2.63 a day for the room. And the Navy had an allowance for quarters when they couldn't put you in one of the other installments. And I stayed there the entire time. They gave me a room on the 9th floor. I requested it, in a very quiet room in the back of the hotel, in one of the probably the most quiet area of the hotel. But every time I'd go out of town, I would send my foot locker and a clothes bag with my uniforms to check it in at the porter's desk. And when I tell them that I was coming back, I get in touch with them and let them know when I was coming in so they could get my same room back again. And they did that many times, but when they couldn't give it to me, when I would go to the desk, they would say, "Lieutenant, we're going to give you a suite." And that happened on several occasions, but I felt very guilty about it. I would always move, if I could move out to my room, I would do it. So those few times when I had the suite, I used it to good advantage.
What about Nebraska? Where did you stay?
Oh, there I was in a bachelor quarter, and we had a wonderful, it was an outstanding installation. We had a wonderful officers club, which was an old barn. One of the architects, who was an architect who was an engineer who was stationed there, supervised, and within a few weeks or a month, they made me the liquor buyer for the officers club, and then I became the president, the head of the officers club. Ran the officers club, and it was a great experience. We had a swimming pool, and it was a charming place. One time we had the admiral from Washington as a guest. Also, he was making an inspection, and he was head of the group of installations of our type that did work for the military and made the ammunition and other parts. And they were highly regarded in the Navy, and he was so pleased with the treatment that he got at our station that he said to me, "If you ever need any help, or I can be of help to you, don't hesitate to call on me." So when I requested an active duty separation from the Navy, I wrote him a letter, and it helped tremendously in putting it through.
And what did you do at that point? Did you go back to Joseph and Fife?
Yeah, I went back to Joseph and Fife.
And you were living in New York again?
I was living in New York, but in the meantime, I had met this girl. I was divorced from Carrie.
You got divorced during the war?
1943, I think it was, on advisement of the doctors and everybody else. It wasn't my decision. Carrie was not feeling well, was not doing too great. She was, while we were in New York, she was in Payne Whitney Clinic in New York, which is a top treatment for her problem. And the psychiatrist, I'll never forget, they called me in one day and they said, what kind of a life is this for you? And I said, well, I have my daughter, and I can take it. And they said, it doesn't look like there's much of a future here, and we would recommend that you get a divorce.
That must have been really hard.
Well, it was difficult, but it was particularly. I was away. I wasn't in New York. I was in Hastings, and you know, they have Jeannie go through all this, but Carrie took it very well too. She must have realized, and Edna was marvelous, and Edna went to New York, sold her farm in Gates Mills, and went to New York.